A few years ago, my family and I moved into a different apartment. We had a rental contract with the owners. And a few months into our stay, we discovered that there was the ownership of the apartment was actually disputed. So there are two different entities that claim ownership over this particular piece of real estate, and we have an agreement with one of those entities to live there, and the other entity is saying, no, your agreement is not valid because it belongs to us. It's an awkward situation. It's confusing. And when there is disputed ownership, there's a consistent question of who has the right to control a possession or a person or a location. And in our study of Exodus, we have arrived at a profound display of God's mercy. Because even after his people flagrantly reject and break God's covenant, yet he chooses to renew that same covenant based exclusively on his own character and actions. God calls Moses back up Mount Sinai and there speaks to him for another 40 days, reissuing the laws by which Israel may live under the covering of God's covenant. Now in Exodus 34, we read about this re-encounter that Moses has with God. As God has said to Moses, I will stand before you. And that's exactly what the text says, that God came and stood before Moses. He proclaimed his name, and he promised his covenant. The next body of God's speech has to do with idolatry, specifically, and the fact that Israel, to live under the covering of his covenant, was to avoid idolatry. They were not to make treaties with idolatrous people, nor with the idols themselves. We looked at that portion of God's speech to Moses 2 weeks ago. But today we'll look at the rest of chapter 34, and the rest of that chapter seems to be a collection of random laws. It's just one after another, God telling Moses laws that his people are to follow, but it's not a complete list of all the laws. It's not, at first glance, it doesn't even necessarily appear that they are grouped together in any particular collection. But I'm going to suggest today that they do fit together, that there is an underlying theme that connects the rest of this chapter. And that theme has to do with ownership. Specifically, God's ownership of his people. And at the end of this chapter, we're going to look at 6 areas of life over which God asserts his ownership. And of course, the conflict arises when God's children, that would be you and me, and also in the context of Exodus, the people of Israel, when we dispute God's ownership over these areas of our lives. It's like when two people dispute who owns a pair of pants. You know what? One or the other is going to win, because both are not going to wear the pants at the same time. Everything that God's children own, have, or are belongs to him. So I'll be reading from Exodus 34, verse 18 through 28. Now remember, the context is that God has just spoken to Moses about idolatry and idols. And then he picks up in verse 18. Celebrate the feast of unleavened bread. For 7 days eat bread made without yeast, as I commanded you. Do this at the appointed time in the month of Abib, for in that month you came out of Egypt. The first offspring of every womb belongs to me, including all the firstborn males of your livestock, whether from herd or flock. Redeem the firstborn donkey with the lamb, but if you do not redeem it, break its neck. Redeem all your firstborn sons. No one is to appear before me empty-handed. 6 days you shall labor, but on the 7th day you shall rest. Even during the plowing season and harvest you must rest. Celebrate the Feast of Weeks with the first fruits of the wheat harvest, and the Feast of Ingathering at the turn of the year. 3 times a year, all your men are to appear before the sovereign Lord, the God of Israel. I will drive out nations before you and enlarge your territory, and no one will covet your land when you go up 3 times each year to appear before the Lord your God. Do not offer the blood of a sacrifice to me along with anything containing yeast, and do not let any of the sacrifice from the Passover feast remain until morning. Bring the best of the first fruits, your soil, to the house of the Lord your God. Do not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. When the Lord said to Moses, write down these words, for in accordance with these words I have made a covenant with you and with Israel. Moses was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights, without eating bread or drinking water, and he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 Commandments. As I said earlier today, from this passage, we want to draw out 6 areas of God's ownership in the life of his children. The first area actually has to do with the previous passage. I mentioned it already about idolatry. We didn't read it this morning, but for the sake of context, I need to refer back to that. Israel was not to make a treaty either with the idolatrous people nor with idols themselves, but what was the alternative? What were they supposed to do? Smash, tear down, and break down the idols. And this was to be done based upon the name of God and his character. And that specific name was Elkanah, a jealous God. A God who is jealous for the worship and the well-being and the life and the godliness of his people. And here's the point. The worship of God's people belongs completely and exclusively to God. That's the first area. Our worship is his alone. And to give our worship to any other person or entity or possession or relationship or thing is to engage in idolatry. Our worship belongs to God alone. So after addressing idols and idolatry, God reminds Israel, his people, to celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That's the Passover. They were to celebrate it at the time of year that God had freed them from Egypt. The month of Abib is what the text says. And we remember what this feast commemorates. The night that God redeemed Israel from slavery, that he led them out of Egypt, that he set them free and he made them his children. Now, that word redeemed, it has a wonderful sound to it. We like it. We like singing about it. And it does describe a remarkable blessing because that word to redeem means to buy back. God bought Israel. He paid the price to make Israel his own. And this truth is emphasized by the prophet Isaiah. God speaking through him in chapter 43, verse 1 of Isaiah, God says through Isaiah to Israel, fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have summoned you by name. You are mine. Now, in the same vein, God has purchased his church. That's us. 1 Corinthians 6, 19 through 20 states that God's people are not our own. Paul actually writes this to the church at Corinth. He says, you are not your own. You were bought at a price. And the implication from that verse, Paul goes on to say, therefore, since you were bought and you are not your own, honor God in your bodies. What was the price that bought us? It was the blood and death of Jesus. So what's the point? God owns his people. You, me, the Israelites, we all belong to God, all that we are. And if God owns us, what are the implications for how we live? And it's worth noting that we don't have a problem talking about belonging to God. But when we turn it around and we say that God owns us, what different feeling does that raise in you? Because this starts we talk about anyone owning another human being, what do we immediately think of? We start thinking of slavery. We start thinking of abuse. We start thinking of control. And yet, if God has purchased us and He has redeemed us and we belong to Him, that means He owns us. Do our actions and our choices and our priorities and our worship line up with God's ownership, or are we disputing His ownership of ourselves? Because the second point, if the first point is that our worship belongs to God, the second point is we belong to God. In other words, all that we are, us, ourselves, our souls, minds, hearts, bodies, we belong to God. From time to time, I have been blessed by people being willing to loan me a car if I need a car for a specific reason. And I don't know about others of you, but every time I'm in that situation, I actually tend to take better care of a borrowed car than I take of my own. You know, I don't want to eat in the car. I want to make sure that I return it in good condition. And that's actually maybe an analogy for how we think of ourselves. If we acknowledge that we are owned by God, that is going to have an impact on how we act, on what we say, on what we watch, on how we treat others, how we use our time, what we talk about. Because we're using something borrowed, in a sense. So the point that God makes in commanding Israel to celebrate the Passover is a reminder that God owns them. They are His people, and they belong exclusively to God. There's no shared ownership. God owns His people. And thirdly, after claiming ownership of their worship and their whole selves, God turns to their possessions. In the ancient Near East, wealth was primarily measured in livestock, flocks and herds. If you doubt this, read the book of Job, just the beginning, as it describes Job's wealth. And his wealth is all contabilizado. It's all accounted for in terms of the animals that he owned, the flocks and the herds. And it's directly over these possessions that God claims ownership. If Moses were writing today, instead of flocks and herds, he might have mentioned houses and cars and electronics and devices and businesses and investments. Possessions. Stuff we have. Stuff that we usually say that we own. How does God remind Israel that He owns ultimately their possessions? Because their possessions come from Him. It's in verses 19 and 20 of Exodus 34. Every firstborn from every womb of every female animal was to be given to the tabernacle to support the priests and the location of worship. And that was one way that God was reminding them, every firstborn from every female of your flocks and herds belongs to God. And not only just every firstborn, but he also states that every firstborn male. So I can imagine in our humanity, if this were our context, I think most of us would be hoping and praying that the first offspring would always be a male. Because if the first offspring was a female, that meant you gave that female to God, and then whenever a male came, then you gave that to God as well. Now, this doesn't mean that only the firstborn belonged to God, but it was a consistent reminder. It was a way that God had instituted in His people a consistent, regular reminder that the stuff that they had belonged to Him. Has that truth changed? No. All that you have, all that I have, belongs to God. The question isn't who owns it. The question is whether we acknowledge that ownership or whether we dispute it. Are our possessions consistently at God's disposal, Or are we selfish and overprotective of our stuff, of what we have? And as Paul recommends, do we share with others who are in need? Do we practice hospitality? Or do we hoard what we have for our own use? Everything that God's people own belongs to God. Now, in saying these things and in giving these commands, God is already stepping on humanity's toes. Right? When he starts talking about our possessions and our worship and even our own selves, but he goes deeper. Because still in the same context of redemption, God reminds Israel that their children, and I would suggest that by extension their families, belong to him as well. God requires that every firstborn son from each family be redeemed. In other words, God was saying, you don't have to give your firstborn sons to the tabernacle, but in their place, you have to give a lamb. You have to redeem your firstborn son. Why? Because your descendants, your children, your families, they belong to me. And as we know, it's easy to forget that truth. I think as parents, we want to claim ownership over our children and over our families. We say, oh, it's okay for the children of others to suffer. It's sad, but it's okay for God to call people from other families to live in difficult places in the world. God, you're free to make missionaries. In fact, I'm going to pray that you raise up a lot of missionaries from Calvary International Church to go to hard places in the world. But I'll pray that it will be others, not my children. I want to set my children on a good career path. I want to make sure that they are set on a road that is going to keep them comfortable and secure, and where they're going to earn a lot of money and they're going to be well cared for and comfortable their whole lives. But here God says to Israel, hey, this is a reminder. Listen, your children, your families, they're valuable. They're important, but they're mine. We already spent time discussing the importance and implication of the Sabbath when we looked at the Ten Commandments. We noted how the Sabbath rest was made for humanity. It was meant to be a blessing and not a burden, but that we have interpreted that today to be a burden. That God would say to his people, one day a week you can rest. Not only you can, but you must rest. And we say, I don't want to rest. I don't want to rest. We're always tired, we're always stressed, we're always exhausted, but I don't want to rest. That Sabbath, that's a burden. Sometimes what humanity most needs, true rest, we most often resist and refuse. I've used this illustration before, but it's still so fascinating to me. One time when Ethan was young, he was a toddler, and it had been a long day. He had not gotten his nap in the afternoon that he usually got. We had been out with friends. I don't remember where we were, maybe a birthday party. And we got home at night, and he was so tired, but he was also so restless and fussy. And we put him to bed, and he would not calm down. And Julie and I both knew what this kid most needs is just to go to sleep. But he would not be still, and he'd fuss. And finally, I'll be honest, sort of in desperation, I went into his room, and I leaned over the crib, and I was not mean, but I held him still. He was lying on his stomach, and I just put my hand on his back and on his legs, and I just gently held him in place, and he was asleep within 30 seconds. It was amazing to me. And I thought, that image of God working in his children, where we're fighting and restless and trying to take care of our own issues and resolve our own problems, and God's just saying, rest. Now, in this context of Sabbath, and in this context of God's ownership, there's a further implication and another layer of meaning, I think, when God reaffirms to Israel that they must observe the Sabbath. By requiring this of them, God's saying to them, your time is mine. Your time belongs to me. And it's interesting there when he talks about Sabbath that he also says busyness is not a reason for your time not to belong to me. He's specific. He says, you must observe the Sabbath. And then he says, even when you're sowing and even when you're plowing. Those are the busiest times of the year, or when you're harvesting, rather, when you're plowing and when you're harvesting. The two busiest times of the agricultural year, planting and harvest. And those are the times, isn't it, for us, when we are most busy. As far as I know, no one here actually survives because you're planting and harvesting. Some of you may have grown up on farms. Some of you may have a little garden. But that's not how you survive. For Israel, this is how they survived. Their flocks and herds and their crops. That was it. And God's saying, even at the most crucial financial time of the year for you, your time belongs to me. And to be a visible reminder of that, one day in 7, no matter how busy you are, no matter how essential your work or your job, you take the time to acknowledge me with your time. Today, to put that in context, God might say, even when you're working overtime, even when you're stressed, if you're an accountant, even at tax time, you are busy beyond belief, your time belongs to me. And the sixth and final area, at least in this passage, that God addresses is the area of our earnings. So this is a little different than our possessions. Possessions are things we already own. But he talks then to Israel about what they earn, about their income, that their income belongs to him. Twice in this passage, God addresses first fruits. They're to celebrate with the first fruits of their harvest, and they are to bring the first fruits of their crops to the tabernacle, to the house of God. And he doesn't just say the first fruits, but he says the best of the first fruits you are to bring to the tabernacle. And I mean, that's a hard thing, isn't it? If you think about someone who has waited and worked all year for that harvest. So at the previous harvest, they saved the seed. And then at the right time, they prepared the soil, they plowed, they plant. Maybe they were going hungry while they did it, and they watched the crop come up, and they cared for it. And as they were able, they would water it and protect it from animals, protect it from plagues as best they could. And then finally, that first day of harvest, and they reap it, and then God says, all right, that you've waited for, all planting season, bring the best of that to me. These things God requires of them have to do with their earnings, the result of their work and their labor. And it's a concrete way that God reminds his people that their earnings, so their salaries and all their income, belong to him. A lot of the application from this passage is going to come next week. But what I want us to get from it today is to notice a commonality between all these categories. That they are all areas in which people, us, you and me, are particularly susceptible to idolatry. Ultimately, that's the context of this chapter. Are we not tempted to idolize self? First of all, to put ourselves on the throne of our lives, to see ourselves as kings and queens who control our own destiny, who might say with the poet William Ernest Henley, I am the master of my fate, I am the captain of my soul. So God says, Your entire self belongs to me. But our tendency is to make ourself an idol. What about possessions? Right? That's not a hard leap for us to see how possessions can become idols. And if you say, you know what, I don't have a problem with idolatry of possessions at all, then my first question would be for you. Give this to me today and do without it for a week. And then let's talk and see if you have an issue or a propensity toward idolatry of possessions. I'm not saying just because you rely on a smartphone that you idolize it, okay? That's not what I'm saying. I'm using that as an example. If God said to us, could you live without this possession? What's our reaction? What's our heart? We do have a tendency to idolize stuff. How about children and family? Particularly for parents, we often idolize our children. And we actually put them at a place of priority in our lives above God. Family is deeply important. But if it is given a place of honor above God, or if it is not surrendered to God, then I would suggest that it has become an idol. And what about our time? Time can be an idol. Are we generous with the time that God has given us, or are we selfish? We're not wanting to use it for the good of others or for the purposes of God. And of course, our earnings, our money, our cash, how easily we can worship and serve money and income. And please know, this isn't addressing people who are exclusively wealthy or exclusively poor. Anyone, regardless of how much you have, we can equally idolize money. So each of these areas, God knows the propensity of his people. He knows what the temptation is going to be. He knows where they are going to be particularly susceptible to idolatry. And he addresses these issues right at the beginning. And his point is, I own all of it. And there's a difference. I'm glad that we sang this hymn, I Surrender All. It's amazing to me how often God weaves together the songs we sing with what his message for us from his word. But when we sing I Surrender All, I think we need to make sure that we have the right perspective. The perspective is not that I own everything, and because I am so generous, I'm giving it all to God. No. What is the correct perspective? God already owns everything. So when I sing I Surrender All, I'm saying, God, forgive me for trying to hold on to it, for disputing your ownership. So when we sing I Surrender All, the image we should have is us saying, okay, all right, Lord. Not, okay, I have all this stuff and I'm giving it to you, God, because I'm so big-hearted. No, it's you own it, God. Forgive me for disputing your ownership. Now, embedded within this passage, we see how God leads his people to prevent idolatry in these areas. So he doesn't just address them, he institutes in his people a practice in order to consistently affirm God's ownership. And simply put, that practice is giving. It is giving. Giving is always off the top. Notice how God, that word first comes up again and again. The firstborn, the first fruits. The firstborn of flocks and herds, the firstborn son, the first fruits of their crops. And so there's a very powerful principle of the prevention of idolatry in these areas, and that is giving to God. He already owns it, let's be clear, he already owns it. But in releasing portions of it concretely to him. And God's saying, this is the primary way that my people will avoid idolatry in these areas. Giving me a portion of their time, giving me a portion of their income, giving me a portion of their possessions, giving me, symbolically, but nonetheless, giving me their children. And the further principle is that we give of the best to the Lord. Now, next week we're going to be talking, well, I say we, right? I'm going to be talking. Let's just be honest. I'm going to be talking and sharing with you about some of the practical ways that God would have us today, in our current context, give. But there is the principle here that we do give, and that we give of our best to the Lord. I know many of you remember Jane Meacham, and she lived here in Brazil for decades. And one of my favorite stories that she would tell was when she was first in Brazil in the late 60s and early 70s, she would receive what was called care packages from a church in the United States that was supporting her. And one of the main things that she would receive in this care package were used tea bags. So all the women of the church made it a project that every time they drank tea, they would save those tea bags, dry them out, and because, of course, the missionaries would want these, the used tea bags. Now, we kind of laugh about that today, right? But maybe we need to look at ourselves and say, okay, Lord, when it comes to my possessions, when it comes to my time, when it comes to my earnings, when it comes to my family and my children, am I giving you the used tea bags? Those things that are not a sacrifice at all to give, right? Because if I didn't give them to the missionaries, I'd drop them in the trash. Because if that is our attitude toward God with ourselves, our possessions, our time, our families, our money, to give only the leftovers and that which is already used up, then probably those things have become idols in our lives. So today, let's first examine ourselves in these areas, noting if the Holy Spirit reveals to us idolatrous tendencies, and surrendering ourselves once more to God, and acknowledging His ownership over all that we are, over our worship, over ourselves, our time, our possessions, our families, our earnings. Let's release those again to Him. This morning, we celebrate communion. And this enactment is a visual, physical reminder that we have been redeemed, that we are not our own, that we are bought at a price. And the price was the body and blood of Jesus that He sacrificed for us. So I invite you to reflect on these things as we prepare the table, as we begin to celebrate and remember the sacrifice of God on our behalf to buy us back, to make us His own.